Shootings in Safe Street zones. Can the investigation happen if the Safe Streets workers who were there aren't working with BPD? To a typo in an email address, delaying dozens of juvenile crime cases. Have you ever seen something like this happen? And ICE detainers ignored.
If you're in Howard County, those judges should know that county doesn't work with us.
I've been going in depth on all of these issues for the past few weeks, and tonight I have updates in all three investigations. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of Fox 45 News in Depth. I'm Mackenzie Frost. Today, we're following updates in three stories we've covered recently: immigration, juvenile crime, and Safe Streets. First, Safe Streets. In recent weeks, we have seen several shootings inside Safe Streets zones. Some of those shootings have involved current and former Safe Streets workers just blocks from their workplaces. We've reached out to police for updates on those investigations, but they haven't given us many answers. We've been investigating the Safe Streets program for years, but the city remains tight-lipped on how exactly the program works. The program hires ex-convicts as violence interrupters and others, but we don't know who they are, how they're vetted, or what they do. Safe Streets receives millions of dollars each year to cover a relatively small area, just 2.6 square miles of the city. Taxpayer advocate David Williams says he'd like to see more transparency from the program to ensure tax dollars are actually keeping people safe.
City and federal taxpayers are paying a lot of money for safe streets, and what they want are safe streets. And where is the money going? Why isn't the money actually providing the safety that people need?
Within a 30-day period, there have been at least 3 shootings in 2 Safe Street zones in Penn North and here in Sandtown, Winchester. Both of those locations butt up together. Let's start with July 14th. Brandon Tucker, a former Safe Streets worker, was shot here along the 1700 block of North Carey Street. He died a few days later. And when you zoom out and take a look from above, you can see just how close this shooting was to the Penn North Safe Street site, the place where Tucker once worked. Fast forward 1 month later to August 14th. Around the corner from where Brandon Tucker was shot and killed, gunfire erupting again. This time along the 1700 block of North Calhoun, a triple shooting. BPD says a juvenile was shot. As our investigation continues to unfold, this time we uncovered another Safe Streets worker who was shot on August 10th. And now we know that employee was off duty and a worker here at the Sandtown Winchester Safe Street site. The city won't give us the name of this violence interrupter, but we do know the shooting itself took place while he was off duty, and it was on the same street as where Brandon Tucker was shot and killed, this time on the 1300 block of North Carey Street. And from above, you can see just how close this shooting was from his workplace, the Sandtown Safe Street site. This string of shootings renewing questions about what's going on within the Safe Street zones. Catholic Charities is the community-based organization operating both the Penn North and Sandtown Safe Streets locations. It, along with the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, or MONSE, will not disclose the off-duty Sandtown Safe Streets worker's name. They also will not disclose how long this employee has worked as a violence interrupter.
Stop shoot, stop live. Stop shoot, stop live.
MONSE holding shooting responses for the triple shooting.
What do we need? Safe streets. What do we need? Yeah.
And for one of their own. That's where Fox 45 News caught up with MONSE Director Stephanie Mavronis, asking her if the Safe Streets program should temporarily pause given the violence interrupters getting shot.
I'm not going to let one incident involving a current employee and an incident that involves someone who was previously affiliated with the program draw any kind of relationship or larger judgment on the program itself. We need to make sure that we continue to support them, not walk away in these moments when things get tough.
Fast forward nearly 3 weeks, the Sandtown Safe Streets worker has yet to be named publicly. But sources tell Fox 45 News he remains in the hospital, recovering from severe injuries. And Mayor Brandon Scott maintains the investigation is underway.
I think that we'll treat this case, our detectives treat this case like we do any case when someone's shot, right? We're going to follow the lead of the people who are the professionals who do this every single day. and allow them to say, okay, this is when we need to push more information out because we don't want to risk any part of that case.
Can the investigation happen if the Safe Streets workers who were there aren't working with BPD?
It's investigations happen all the time without witnesses, whether it's a BPD worker, a Safe Streets worker, someone working in a barber shop, right? We have ways of solving cases. You see us solve cases where there were no witnesses. So we'll be able to do that work. We have great detectives and they'll do that work.
One former Safe Streets worker, Brandon Tucker, shot and killed this summer. Another violence interrupter caught up in this same violence he's paid to prevent. All while the rest of the Safe Streets workers
You gotta build up your community.
remain on the job
Stop shooting. Stop shooting.
and in the streets. Now, I sent a list of questions to Monty and Catholic Charities, the community-based organization overseeing both the Penn North and Sandtown Safe Streets locations. We're asking about the Sandtown shooting victim's condition, whether he's participating in the investigation, and how long he's worked for Safe Streets. We also are asking questions about the Penn North shooting. We're asking about Tucker's employment history and staffing at that location. So far, we haven't gotten any answers. We've also investigated potential gang ties inside Safe Streets locations. In July, David Warren pleaded guilty to one count of federal racketeering conspiracy connected to the Black Guerrilla Family Gang, or BGF. According to court documents, he admitted to attending BGF meetings at a Safe Streets location, calling it a, quote, BGF clubhouse. And back in January, Tyrell Jeffries also pleaded guilty to federal racketeering conspiracy as part of the same indictment. Investigators say Jeffries was a BGF member who met up at the same Safe Streets location as Warren, storing guns, drugs, and plotting hits on rival gang members. They also say two BGF members who attended those meetings were Safe Streets employees. We pressed Mayor Brandon Scott about these indictments and whether there could be criminal activity inside other Safe Streets locations. Can you definitively say that similar things are not happening at other Safe Streets locations in the city?
What I can say is that anytime that we find anybody being involved in criminal activity, Mackenzie, we remove those people and turn those over to the other parts of the justice system. I said to you 1,000 times, I don't care if those things are being had at the DBW office, if they're being plotted out in the basement of Fox 45 TV, wherever they're being plotted out, our folks are working to find those people and remove them and working with our law enforcement partners, as was the case in this case.
Overall, Fox 45 News has uncovered at least 6 people connected to Safe Streets in some way who later were found guilty of crimes like drug distribution, assault, or federal racketeering conspiracy. We'll continue to investigate the Safe Streets program and demand answers and accountability from the mayor and other program leaders. Still to come, we're digging deeper into an email typo that caused delays in more than 100 juvenile cases. We pressed DJS and BPD about how it happened and what comes next. And as we head to break, let's take a look at some of today's top headlines.
Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott signing an executive order creating framework for how funds from opioid settlements will be used.
We are taking decisive action to address this epidemic.
The city is bringing in $242.5 million for settlements with Allergan, CVS, and Cardinal Health. As part of those settlements, $42 million has already been allocated to specific care providers and organizations. Another $20 million will go to the health department. But now, with this executive order, what's left will go toward an opioid restitution fund, where agencies and organizations can apply for money.
We know Jason Billingsley will be sentenced for 2 counts of attempted murder. Billingsley pleaded guilty to those charges as part of a plea deal earlier this week. We also expect him to take a plea deal in the second crime he's accused of committing, the murder of Pavel Lepere. Lepere's parents say they'll be in court and addressing the result. Proceedings begin at 9 a.m. I, of course, will be there providing updates on air and online, including social media platforms.
they filed reports, they filed charges, and then it's just disappeared, and the victims haven't heard anything. And that is unacceptable.
The Department of Juvenile Services remains under scrutiny due to an incorrect email the police department was using to refer cases for possible charges. The mistake dates back to 2022, and now it's still unclear how many cases were impacted and what might happen next. The Department of Juvenile Services can get cases a few different ways. When a young person is physically brought in, a decision about whether charges will be filed happens at intake, or police can submit paperwork for a decision. While that happens, the juvenile usually remains in the community. In 2022, an email was given to the Baltimore Police Department to use to send those paper cases to the Department of Juvenile Services, but those cases never made it to DJS. Have you ever seen something like this happen in your experience?
I haven't, no.
Catherine Rosenblatt, Deputy Chief of the Juvenile Division at the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office, says more than 100 cases were impacted, a mix of misdemeanor and felony cases. Baltimore police say the issue was first discovered in June of this year, and yet still, nearly 3 months later, the breakdown of felony versus misdemeanor cases is unclear.
If there's an inability to prosecute these cases because they occurred over 365 days ago, which is most misdemeanors in the state of Maryland, that means there are going to be people, victims, who cases, not only will the cases never see the light of day, if you were entitled to restitution for your vehicle being stolen or damaged, you're never going to get that restitution.
Jeremy Eldridge, a Baltimore area defense attorney, says the impacts of this one mistake could be long-lasting.
We have victims who have been waiting in the wings for a year and will never see resolution of their cases. And that is painful and decreases already the distrust we have between the community and the police department, and obviously DJS.
Months later, a clear explanation of how this could have happened remains elusive. Originally, a DJS spokesperson said it worked with BPD to, quote, identify referrals that were impacted by a typo in an email address from many years ago. BPD says it learned of the issue during an audit of the cases, only to find out there were no outcomes. Quote, it was learned that many of the cases were not in their system, according to a BPD spokesperson, adding, we followed the process given to us by DJS to email the referrals, and therefore no one within BPD would be disciplined. We took that statement from police to DJS, and the statement from DJS changed slightly. Instead of a typo, a spokesperson for DJS says the problem stemmed from an unknown IT glitch. So we went back to the Department of Juvenile Services only to be told that that unknown IT glitch was actually the typo in the email. Given the evolution of explanation, we continue to demand answers. On August 26th, we sent DJS more questions asking, were the cases being sent to an active email address that just wasn't being monitored, or was it an incorrect email address that would have sparked an error on mail delivery for BPD when the emails were sent in the first place? Has DJS started receiving the details for the various cases? If so, has DJS identified cases that are no longer eligible for action due to a statute of limitations? Those questions ignored. Instead of responding, a DJS spokesperson pointed us back to the previous statements, not answering the new questions. Meanwhile, the agency says an action plan has been developed with BPD to fully resolve the issue, noting it's unique to Baltimore City.
BPD is going to resubmit the cases, and DJS has agreed that all felonies will be processed per the statute.
After our first investigation revealed the problem, paper cases from BPD will now be sent to both a central email at DJS and the state's attorney's office. Now, I sent a list of questions to BPD about the email typo, including whether BPD did get a bounce back email when cases were referred to the wrong address, and if they had a breakdown of how many cases were impacted by this incorrect email. A spokesperson for BPD responded, saying they did not receive a bounce back email and directed us back to DJS for the case breakdown. I spoke with State Delegate Kathy Shalega, who represents parts of Baltimore and Harford counties, about this email issue, and I asked her what, if anything, can be done at the state level to prevent this from happening again.
Well, I believe they could indeed create secure information sharing, and I'm not sure paper sharing is more secure than doing it using technology. Look, I'm glad the audit found that problem, and it certainly makes a case for more audits.
If there was anything that you and other lawmakers could do at the state level to create some sort of online portal where these cases can be submitted instead of having to rely on email and perhaps human error.
Yeah, those kind of IT and security reforms are really important, and they're not public facing, so people often forget how important they are.
Delegate Kathy Shalega raises concerns about the victims involved in these cases.
What the audit turned up were 100 or more cases where victims were forgotten. And, what does that create? And in a climate where we're having trouble getting victims to come forward and make victims feel like they're going to be protected, the victims feel like they've been ignored and forgotten because, frankly, they were. So I'd like to see them take a really good look at protecting victims and making people in the communities know that if they come forward, they will be protected.
Delegate Shalega also taking issue with the juvenile reform laws lawmakers just passed earlier this year. She says there should be even more changes next year.
The weak and modest reforms that were made to that bill that are just going into effect, I think will help, but I'm certain we'll be back because we really need to make crime illegal again. We are not doing these kids a favor by telling them that they're not responsible for their crime, and they're creating victims of crime. I think the public's had enough, and I hope that we see real reform measures next year in Annapolis.
Do you believe that DJS Secretary Vincent Schiraldi is taking his role seriously enough to move this department forward to ensure that juveniles have the services that they need and are held accountable?
Yeah, I think that Vincent Schiraldi, the Secretary of Juvenile Services, should be calling for more audits. If this happened, what else is going on? And he should be looking at this immediately to make immediate changes and improvements to the system.
Now, we've pressed DJS for more details about what goes on inside its facilities as well. A spokesperson says the department has been working to drive down staff vacancy. And as of this month, the rate has dropped from 16% to a little more than 10%. They also say the department has 237 youth under DJS supervision on home monitoring. There are 59 community detention officers and 10 supervisors in charge of that monitoring, with 5 vacancies. DJS also says it's preparing for changes related to that new juvenile justice law you just heard the delegate talk about, with community members and support services meeting to update agency policy and workflow. After the break, the immigration debate continues across Maryland, with multiple women allegedly killed by suspects in the country illegally. Delegate Kathy Shalega will be back with her proposal for a statewide ICE policy. The immigration debate continues in Maryland nearly a year after Harford County mother Rachel Marin's murder. Investigators say Victor Martinez Hernandez, a man from El Salvador living in the United States illegally, killed Marin and evaded authorities for months. And now a new report from independent investigative journalist Catherine Herridge claims Marin's death could have been prevented if U.S. Customs and Border Protection had followed a 2005 DNA law. The DNA Fingerprint Act calls for agents to collect DNA from migrants who are detained or arrested at the border and send that evidence to the FBI. 3 federal whistleblowers included in Herridge's report argue if Homeland Security had collected Martinez Hernandez's DNA, they could have connected him to a crime in Los Angeles less than 6 months before Marin's murder, detaining him before he had a chance to murder. Rachel Marin is the second woman investigators believe was murdered by an undocumented immigrant in Howard County. Earlier this month, authorities sentenced another man from El Salvador in the United States illegally for the 2022 murder of Kayla Hamilton. 19-year-old Walter Javier Martinez, who was 16 at the time of the murder, pled guilty to raping and murdering Hamilton at their shared home in Aberdeen. Martinez also admitted to 4 other murders and 2 rapes. In Howard County, ICE is accusing the county executive of ignoring an ICE detainer. Federal authorities say they asked the Howard County Detention Center to hold an illegal immigrant until ICE agents could take him into custody. According to ICE, the detention center released him anyway. Maryland ICE Director Matthew Elliston says Howard County is standing in the way of ICE enforcement can have a ripple effect across the country.
The fact that this person is unlawfully here does not guarantee they're going to be, removed from the country. And in Howard County, they're going to release them. Doesn't mean the person's even going to stay in Maryland. We've had a couple cases so far this year where people have been released from Howard County and then gone to commit crimes in Virginia and Texas. It doesn't mean they'll even stay in the state for us to come find them.
I also asked Delegate Kathy Szeliga about ICE detainers and a statewide policy. She says she's ready to push for change in Annapolis.
This is a problem that was really highlighted with the brutal rape and murder of Rachel Marin in Harford County. And we've seen other victims of crime. And that is why Mark Elrich, the county executive in Montgomery County, changed his policy to say that Montgomery County law enforcement will cooperate with ICE. Look, I've had the bill numerous years in Annapolis to require law enforcement, local detention centers who are holding a criminal that's been convicted of a crime in Maryland to be turned over to ICE when ICE has a detainer on them.
What can lawmakers do in the General Assembly? Is there a possibility of a statewide policy to require local jurisdictions to honor these ICE detainers?
Yes, I am going to introduce a bill again next year. And the bill I had introduced in the past had focused on violent criminals and sex offenders who were convicted of that crime in Maryland to require the detention centers to cooperate with ICE when they've put in a request for a detention to hold and turn over that criminal. I'm going to broaden that and say if there is a criminal in the state of Maryland who's been convicted of another crime and ICE has a detainer on them, they must be turned over to ICE.
I believe that there would be enough support for such a measure if a previous attempt to require these ICE detainers to be honored with a narrower scope didn't see success.
We've seen an escalation in crime by illegal immigrants who ICE has a detainer on. So we're going to press Wes Moore to come along and help support my bill. I already have a number of co-sponsors ready to go on that bill. So, if we're just not going to back down, we're going to continue pushing to protect citizens in the state of Maryland.
Now, Governor Moore has spoken out about immigration in Maryland, though he has called out what he sees as inaction on the federal level to address the border. He claims a statewide immigration policy is not possible.
The idea that somehow the state has an ICE policy, there's nowhere that a state has an ICE policy. And frankly, for anyone who's talking about what should the state do, I tell people they're either politically motivated or they're just deeply uninformed.
But the governor's claims are not necessarily true. According to the Immigration Legal Resource Center, several states, including Florida, Texas, West Virginia, and Iowa, do require local law enforcement to cooperate with ICE in detention efforts. Maryland immigration policy will likely be a major topic during the next legislative session. I'll bring you full coverage from Annapolis when session starts up again in January. That's all for this week's edition of Fox 45 News In Depth. I'm Mackenzie Frost.
I'm Mary Bubala. Thank you for watching. Here's another video for you to watch. Also take some time to subscribe to our YouTube channel.